Spanish or Portuguese, which language is easier to learn? That's a question I get a lot as I teach both languages. Yes, I teach Spanish. I also teach Portuguese. If you want to learn Spanish or Portuguese, you can join my Polyglot Spanish or Portuguese Bootcamp. I launch every now and then, so definitely check the link in my description to know when. Let's get right into it. So I'm going to give you a couple of facts and also personal experience. I speak both languages fluently. I first learned Spanish and then I learned Portuguese. But I also know people who learn Portuguese first and then Spanish, even though that's not the usual way. Usually it's the other way around. People learn Spanish first and then Portuguese. Obviously, both languages are very similar, and that's due to the fact that they are sister languages. They both are Romance languages, which means they come from Latin. Latin is the base for both languages, and actually, they are the languages that are the most similar. Spanish and Portuguese is so similar that even if you haven't learned either language, but you speak one of the languages, you will be able to understand the other. I first learned Spanish, as I said, I was fluent in it. That's when I decided to learn Portuguese, and I was able to understand most of Portuguese and even read Portuguese without ever having studied it. So once I studied it, it was a lot easier because I actually was fluent in Spanish. That goes to show that one language resembles the other a lot. Of course, there are also a lot of differences, but the similarities definitely outweigh the differences. Now let's get into some key points you need to consider if you want to learn either or language, or if you're even considering learning both languages. Let's look at the similarities. So Spanish and Portuguese share 89% of lexical similarity. That means 89% of the words in either language have a direct equivalent in the other language. That's a lot. So that means if you speak one language, you will be able to understand 89% of the other language. I see it all the time. Whenever I'm in Brazil, I see Brazilians communicating with Spanish speakers because they're in Latin America. Of course, they have a lot of Spanish speaking tourism, like Argentinians, Uruguayans. For the most part, they don't speak Portuguese, just as well as tourists who come to Brazil also don't speak Portuguese for the most part. Brazilians always speak with them in Portuguese and they reply in Spanish. So people have conversations just speaking the language because they understand each other a lot. Of course, it's not everything. There are also a lot of Brazilians who don't understand any Spanish, and also vice versa. But it's actually easier for Brazilians to understand Spanish speakers than the other way around because the Brazilian pronunciation is so different. But when you see the words written, they're almost identical. And lexical similarity also means the words are formed in a very similar way. So for example, if you have a noun with the ending yon in Spanish, it's gonna be aun in Portuguese. You have communication in Spanish, which is comunicación, and you have comunicação. So anytime you have a word with yon at the end in Spanish, you will have aun in Portuguese. So that's the equivalent. And just like that, you can know so many words without even having to study them. Another similarity is the grammar. Once I started learning Portuguese, I actually had to skip the grammar because I saw that it was identical to Spanish grammar. Everything was almost the same. And I actually bought a grammar book and I went through it and I'm like, that's the same. So I just skipped it overall and I was like, okay, I'm gonna concentrate on mainly speaking because I see the grammar functions the exact same way. The subjunctive, the conjugations are very similar. There's a similar pattern to them. So I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna skip that and just go straight ahead and practice my pronunciation because the phonetics are very different, especially Brazilian Portuguese to Spanish. Portuguese from Portugal is more so similar in terms of pronunciations to Spanish. However, it's a lot more difficult to actually understand because they pronounce the vowels very closed off. It's not as open as Brazilian Portuguese. So for a lot of people who actually learn Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese is way easier than European Portuguese. Phonetically, they can be very different also due to the fact that Portuguese has more vowels and Portuguese has also nasal sounds. So just like French, Portuguese has nasal sounds like the A, the E. So for example, you would say não and not now. So no means no. In Spanish, it's just no. In Spanish, you read everything just the exact way it is written. No alterations, but in Portuguese, you have to be mindful of those nasal sounds. Não or pão, because if you pronounce them differently, like pão, it could mean a completely different thing. So you don't want to do that. You want to be careful with those nasal sounds. And that's also a reason why Portuguese is a lot of times considered more difficult, because it just adds more layers to Spanish. Spanish is quite easy as a language, actually. It's quite simple. In Portuguese, it has the same base, but it adds more. Like, for example, with the nasal sounds you have to pronounce. So it adds just a little difficulty more. And of course, the accents vary from place to place. Now let's talk about global presence. Obviously, in Latin America, Brazil is the only country where Portuguese is spoken, and the rest mainly speaks Spanish, with a few exceptions like French Guiana and English, but for the most part, Latin America is Spanish. But Portuguese is also spoken on almost every continent. In Europe, of course, in Portugal, in quite a few African countries like Angola, Mozambique, they also speak Portuguese. And then also even in Asia, in Macau, which was a former Portuguese colony until even the 90s. Obviously, Spanish is one of the most used languages globally and the most represented one. You can also find Spanish on almost every continent. Speaking from personal experience, almost anywhere I travel, I always use Spanish. Of course, in Latin America and also Portuguese. Actually, I meet a lot of Brazilians on my travels, so Portuguese is also one language you will definitely use if you want to learn it. I figured it's the best to learn both Spanish and Portuguese, because when you're in Latin America, you have covered almost the whole continent with Spanish and Portuguese. It is super useful. So my verdict, which language is easier? For me personally, I think Spanish is just easier because it is phonetically less complicated than Portuguese, and in a lot of grammatical ways also, Spanish is just easier to start out with and then build your way up to Portuguese. But it also depends on your native language. If your native language is French, for example, you don't have any problems with nasal sounds. If nasal sounds are new to you, you will have a bit of difficulties. So it depends really on your native language and which language you're starting out with. But generally, I would say Spanish is definitely easier than Portuguese. If you want to learn either language, definitely make sure to join me on my Polyglot Bootcamp, link in the description below, and see you in my next video. Ciao, ciao.